British printers' ornaments. And I'm going to talk first a bit about the experience of creating the database, the motivations behind it, and the challenges we faced. But since others here are far more qualified digital experts than I am, I want to focus on the printers' ornaments themselves. So we're all here to think about how to compile a database of ornaments and typography, but I'd like to pause to think about why. What other things can we do with a database of ornaments besides complete the bibliographical record and make bibliographical inquiries? What kind of research questions can we ask, and how might the design of a database respond to the kinds of things we want to ask of it? So Compositor is a database of over 1 million images, chiefly of printers' ornaments. It was created from 18th Century Collections Online, or ECHO, an online database of 18th century British books published by Gale Cengage. ECHO contains 32 million page images, which were supplied to the Compositor project on a hard drive along with their metadata. So that was our raw material. Here's some printers' ornaments, and here's a typical page, the kind we've seen live today. We required an algorithm that could ignore the text and draw bounding boxes around the two ornaments on the page. To solve this problem, a team developed a method using Python and OpenCV. Basically, the algorithm combines heuristics of where ornaments are typically located and how they look with various image filtering techniques to weed out text and other artifacts on the page and just leave the ornament intact. This method is simple and effective for a large data set, but it's also apt to falsely classify blocks of text or other features as ornaments. We therefore hand-labelled a random sample of extracted images as valid or invalid, and used a bag of visual words approach to train a machine learning model to identify invalid images. Of the nearly 2 million images initially extracted, 1.2 were classified as valid, and a large but less statistically significant number of false positives remained. We were able to remove many of these by using tools provided by the Oxford Visual Geometry Group's suite of publicly available programs for image analysis called CEVAByte. The VGG indexed the database, and we used CEVAByte's VGG image search engine, VISE, V-I-S-E, to create clusters of similar images from the database. I think we briefly saw this in action yesterday. This made it possible to remove large clusters of invalid images that remained in the database, and also to perform visual searches on the database, which was the key point that we wanted to get to. Because, of course, ornaments are not necessarily something that you want to query only by keyword. You want to find visual matches. This is the VISE website. I'll put these links up again at the end. I'll give a very brief tour of the Compositor website, but I can go into more depth at the end if anyone would like. This is the welcome page, and if we click on search, we can search the ornaments using a number of key terms. So search their metadata for the book's author, the book title, publisher, publication place, and you can restrict your search by year and order it. The exciting thing is the software provided by CEVAByte, their VISE feature, which allows you to perform a visual search of the database. You launch the visual search and draw a box around the ornament or area of the ornament you want to search. You hit search, and after a bit of time, this has 69 matches from the database of similar or identical ornaments. We can adjust the score threshold, so how exact it is, to see less exact matches. If we click on a match, you kind of need a bigger screen for this, but it shows you the ornaments side by side, and eventually it gives you the ability to toggle between the two. So there's very little difference between these two, but you can just see the differences in the inking. But this is really useful when you have an ornament that's very similar but not quite the same. It will flag up the differences really clearly to the eye. The CEVAByte tool is brilliant at doing what it's supposed to do, which is doing these visual searches. It's not the most user-friendly interface at the moment. This is something I'd like to update, hopefully, for Compositor, because as you've seen, that big list is just the images. It doesn't immediately show you the metadata. So if you want to hone in on books from particular places or publishers, you need to click into here, then you need to, not very intuitively, click on the ornament code, and then again click on this ornament was extracted from this book, and then you can go down and see the information about the book that the ornament came from. So hopefully at some point in the future we can reduce the number of clicks and have different options of what we display on that landing page. But the main thing is this tool really works at finding matches in the database. The exciting new thing that they're developing is the ability to add your own image to the database and query that, so not just search from within the existing database, but add something of your own. So we can choose a file. I've chosen a small one for an example because they can take quite a long time to upload. But I can add my own image and it'll query it against the database and show me some matches. This is still a bit clunky. It works some of the time, not always. But this, I think, is a really important feature because, as I described, we created our database from 18th century collections online, which doesn't include everything printed in the 18th century in Britain. It includes an awful lot, but there are things missing. So the ability to add your own images in and ultimately add them to the database, but for now query them against it, is important. So why did we go to all this effort to gather 1 million printers' ornaments into a visually searchable database? I didn't have a rationale around a particular publisher or anything. I wanted to assemble these ornaments en masse. So now I'd like to talk about what printers' ornaments are and why they matter for lots of different inquiries. So as we all know, and we've heard today, there are two main types of ornament. First, wood or metal cut ornaments, which, as the name suggests, are designs cut by hand in blocks of wood or metal. They could be sometimes replicated with casts. These can depict anything from geometric shapes to elaborate scenes. And the other kind of ornament is the type ornament or fleuron, pieces of cast metal type depicting flowers, flourishes, leaves or patterns, which can be used individually as small flourishes, or any number could be used to create larger designs. Ornaments are both common, they appear regularly in all types of books, but also exceptional. Printers own unique ornaments depicting all manner of things, and different ornaments might be used in different types of books. Printers' ornaments decorate the pages of hand-pressed books of all kinds, whether they're used subtly or ostentatiously, and whether individual readers pay close attention to them or not. They form a key part of the book's visual identity and modulate the book user's experience. They're miniature works of art. They interrupt and interact with the text and tell us about the book's status or its aspirations. Because they've not been preserved in modern literary editions, many readers, including scholars, are not aware of their existence or of how widespread their use was. When scholars are aware of them, we lack ways of talking about them, of representing them in literary editions, or discussing their meanings. The 18th century reader could not help but have a familiarity with printers' ornaments that we struggle to recapture. We read in modern editions where the text is whitewashed, its original ornamented state is never recorded except in facsimiles. We have unprecedented access to digital ornamented text, but we tend to use facsimiles and digital surrogates for bibliographical inquiries, not as places to read deeply or for the first time. So we've collectively forgotten how to interpret ornaments and lost a range of meanings, I think, that were available to early readers. So the project I'm currently working on seeks to recover the grammar of printers' ornaments, to work on a kind of theory of what they mean and how, to relearn what they might have meant to readers of books in the hand-press period. So let's actually look at some ornaments. A favourite subject of blockmakers was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the book itself. These ornaments all celebrate the book as a physical object. It appears here as the centre of attention, embellished and venerated. Images of closed books do exist in printers' ornaments, but the open page spread is a much more common image, which makes sense. A closed book shows us the binder's work, but the open book shows us the engraver's depiction of their own labour, their own work, because each of these books is itself ornamented. So these images are kind of delightfully self-referential. In some, we can even make out what the ornaments depict. So in the headpiece, top left, which I actually use as the logo for the Compositor website, the engraver is playing a game with us. The reader of the book is looking at an open book which features this ornament, which depicts angels. These angels are holding a book which itself contains an ornament which depicts an angel. There's a kind of endless infinity mirror effect going on. In the large tailpiece on the bottom right, an angel is pointing directly at the tailpiece. This is a tailpiece pointing at a tailpiece. These engravers are having fun, they're celebrating their own craft. They're also telling us something expected but important, that the mind of the engraver envisaged the book as ornamented. Page openings depicted by engravers tend to feature ornaments because they understandably conceive of the book as a decorated and decorative object. This reminds me of Juliet Fleming's take on printers' ornaments in her book Cultural Graphology, where she discusses ornamental typography rather than block ornaments, but she offers some useful ways of thinking about what ornaments have to say. Fleming compares type ornaments to lace, noting that ornamental type has sometimes been called printer's lace in fabric. She writes, "Nothing but ornament self-embellished, it is the vocation of lace to be all border, edging without a field, all edge and without an edge. It can go on playing this game with you." Paradoxically, type ornaments are playful, but they're also signs of work. Like lace, they're worked, but their function is to be attractive. Of course, every letter of the text was set by hand, but in addition to this, compositors took care to assemble type ornaments into cohesive arrangements. They draw attention to the beauty of print and the labour behind it. Type ornaments are showing off. Those ornaments depicted in books are showing off too, and playing in the same kind of way. Janine Barkas reminds us that the ornament always ultimately exists outside the fiction, even as it comments on it. She writes, "The printer's ornament remains an articulation of the printing press, a conventional feature of book production which designates the text in which it appears as a public novel, not a private letter." So ornaments can confer public status on a text. They situate it in the world and say something about its aspirations. They draw attention to the labour of print and the joy of bookcraft. Here are some other ways in which we see engravers celebrating their own trade and showing us their personalities. Tailpieces depicting the interior of print shops were not uncommon. This one shows us two workers at the press, the scene surrounded by vignettes celebrating the book and writing instruments. The headpiece top right shows a man running, holding a sheet of paper, I think. Is he a pamphlet hawker, perhaps with some light messages for the printers? I like to think he's running to the printing house with some last-minute corrections, or from it with the latest magazine or newspaper. Either way, we're seeing the print trade in action as we're reading. The tailpiece depicting Elsevier is in a frame as a common subject, as was Gutenberg. Engravers showed a keen awareness of the origins and advancements of their trade. They clearly felt themselves involved in the whole art of bookmaking, not just as fringe figures. The final image on the right I included because I like this loving depiction of everyday reading, a candle left balanced carelessly on an open book. There's something kind of romantic about this image of a book made by a craftsperson who was proud of what they helped to produce. Another printing office interior is shown here in this tailpiece. This image was probably a copy of a French copperplate, but I like it because it makes clearer than the original a curious feature. There are two men in tricorn hats working the press, but are the two compositors in the background women? I think they are. It's not completely clear. They seem to wear long skirts and bonnets. We know that women worked in the printing industry, but how many images of women at work do we actually have from the 18th century? Very few, yes. Printers' ornaments let the trade present its image of itself to us in new ways. So I've talked about block makers as a group so far, as a group who like to celebrate their trade, but what about them as individuals? A lot of ornament designs are conventional, many got widely copied or cast, but some are totally idiosyncratic and seem to show us the personalities of their makers. Here are a few that I find particularly memorable. Top left is the only example I've found of an ornament celebrating snails. They have ribbons held solemnly in their mouths as they incongruously participate in the elaborate iconography of the ornament. I love this monkey tailpiece. He's holding a book in his left hand and copying it with his right by candlelight. I think he's aping what he's reading. Perhaps he's a hack writer working into the night, copying someone else's work. I see no way of using this ornament without being mischievous. It seems to accuse the reader of combing the book for material to ape, of being derivative or of reading for the wrong reasons, or perhaps it accuses the author of the book of those things. Either way, it's a disconcerting, comical image which is out of step with more common motifs. And finally, a bawdy image which at first appears to be one person, but on closer inspection is actually a couple in an embrace. This block was not reserved for racy novels. If you look at where it appears, we find it in all sorts of text, and I wonder what their authors thought when they saw their book in print with this kind of tailpiece. A final few, bugs. This is an advert in the newspaper for bug repellent, and they've gone to the trouble of getting little bug fleurons for the sure. A tightrope walking elephant used as a headpiece, and two cherubs here. It's not a very high quality image, but it's two cherubs shooting birds directly in the face with very long muskets. The point of all this is that we might expect ornaments to do what they say on the tin, to ornament, to embellish, to beautify the page with images that complement the text, but so often they do the opposite. While every compositor had their share of floral headpieces and classical tailpieces, engravers seem to have wanted to push the boundaries of the book's iconography. They produced ornaments that stand out, that disrupt the reading experience rather than prettifying it. Those ornaments depicting open, ornamented books hold a mirror back up to us as we see the page we're reading depicted in miniature, forcing us to see ourselves reading, to pause over the experience. Others show scenes from the real world of printing or the cityscape in which the book is sold, taking literally the ornament's function of publishing, of situating the text in the world. Those we've just seen find no easy harmony with their texts and stand out wherever they appear, drawing the attention away from the world of the text and into the world of the page. These images have all the force of their makers' personalities leaping off the page as energetically today as when the ink was still wet. Printers' ornaments, of course, have a far more practical use for scholarship. They can be used to identify a book's printer, to date printed material, and to identify piracies or fakes. Printers did not always put their names on title pages, but the unique nature of most printers' ornaments means that they can act like a bibliographical fingerprint. Simply put, as I think we know by now, if the printer of book A is unknown, but it shares ornaments with book B, the printer of which is known, because they're named on the title page or we have other evidence, books A and B probably share a printer. Ideally, we have multiple examples to confirm this. I'd just like to give an example of my own research of why identifying a book's printer can do more for us than just fill in the gaps in the catalogue or expand our knowledge. It can lead in unexpected directions. So in 1725, an 18-year-old Benjamin Franklin moved from Philadelphia to London to buy a printing press and take printing press and types to take back to America and set up a printing house. However, his financial backer let him down, so instead of buying a press and going back, he found work in London as a compositor and pressman for 18 months. Franklin left no record of what he printed during his time in London, although he was apparently in constant attendance, as he tells us in his autobiography, at the printing house, working much harder than any of his English colleagues. Franklin wrote in his autobiography in the 1770s a full account of his time in London and his experience in the printing house, but no record of what he helped to print. He did admit there that he enjoyed his career as a printer, specifically because it gave him a chance to read with the things that he printed. Therefore, a knowledge of what he printed would give us an excellent picture of the books that shaped his intellectual development. That knowledge would have been lost to history without printers' ornaments. So I was able to use an early version of Compositor to discover which printers' ornaments were owned by the printers Franklin worked for, and then to find books in which they appeared during the years Franklin worked there. So I came up with a list of over 40 books Franklin likely helped to print, and which he was probably engaging with to various extents as he printed them. This information is a major finding for Franklin's biography. The books include things like editions of The Spectator, which Franklin described as formative to his education, works of philosophy and religion, and plays. He was an obsessive theatre-goer in London, all thanks to printers' ornaments. One item particularly caught my attention, though. The printing press at which Franklin worked printed an account of a shipwreck in which the English protagonist was washed up on the east coast of America and spent 4 months in Philadelphia before returning home. This narrative is the title page and an illustration of the wreck. This narrative contains a long description of Philadelphia, the town that Franklin made his home. The knowledge that an account of Philadelphia was printed at the London press where Franklin worked inspired me to take a proper look at this shipwreck narrative. Scholars had previously dismissed it as fictional, but in fact I was able to prove that its author did exist and the shipwreck really occurred. The author, Richard Castleman, was a manager at Drury Lane Theatre, just around the corner from where Franklin lived and worked when he was in London. The events that Castleman describes, in fact, happened in 1705, and it was over 20 years before he decided to publish an account of his shipwreck and stay in Philadelphia. So he decided to write about Philadelphia only when its most famous resident-to-be moved in next door. So only this month I published an article arguing that Franklin probably had a hand in Castleman's account of Philadelphia. The coincidence of its publication just when Franklin arrived on the scene is too great to be accidental, and Franklin, with his keen interest in Philadelphian history, probably encouraged the author to publish his experience and possibly even helped him to write it. I've summed this up all very quickly, but the point is to show that evidence from printers' ornaments underpins a potential discovery of a new work by Benjamin Franklin. They have so much to tell us about the circumstances in which books were produced, and when we learn more about book production and circulation, we can make unexpected discoveries. There's plenty that we can learn from printers' ornaments then, but they're not included in modern editions of texts, and even when they're found throughout the original. Shakespeare's First Folio, one of the most famous books in the world, contains printers' ornaments, but you wouldn't know it from looking at any modern edition of Shakespeare. Scholars have often been unaware of the existence of this resource for finding out more about the text they're studying. Following the material turn in literary studies, however, editors are finally starting to wonder if we should be discussing or reproducing printers' ornaments in literary editions, rather than just using them behind the scenes for bibliographical questions. One really interesting attempt to account for ornaments is found unexpectedly not in an edition of a hand-press work, but in the latest edition of the 20th century Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot's collected works. This is T.S. Eliot's poem, Verses to Honour and Magnify Sir Geoffrey Faber, written in 1954 to celebrate the knighthood of Eliot's friend and publisher. It was printed on the single sheet you see here, this is an image of the original, in only a few copies at the Oxford University Press, and presented to Geoffrey Faber at a celebratory dinner. The poem's in rhyming couplets reminiscent of the 18th century poets Dryden and Pope. Allusions to Dryden are found throughout the poem. The sheet was printed using modern casts of 17th century types, and it also features two printers' ornaments, which are reproductions of ornaments first used in the late 17th century by one of Dryden's printers. There's also a dividing line of ornamental type underneath the lengthy subtitle. This poem was never included in a modern edition of T.S. Eliot until 2015, and here's how it appears in that 2015 edition. The editors have felt obliged to take account of the printer's ornaments in the original publication, presumably because, unlike when we're dealing with an 18th century text, they're unique in Eliot. Indeed, this page is unique in the whole volume, and every other page has a footer at the bottom giving the page number and page references for the endnotes and textual history. But to preserve the visual impression of a single sheet, the footer was removed for this page only, leaving the reader to locate the endnotes themselves. And I'm told by the editors that they attempted to, unsuccessfully, to convince the publisher to remove the line numbers as well, to better imitate the appearance of the original. They've also reproduced the first ornament, though the proportions are wrong. But because reproducing all three would cause the poem to run over the page, the type ornaments and tailpiece have been replaced, perplexingly, by rows of division symbols, vaguely mimicking the removed ornaments. A compromise, certainly, but it was clearly felt that it would be wrong to remove the traces of the ornaments altogether. So Eliot's modern editors are telling us that these visual elements will help us understand the poem, that we can't just take them out and forget about them. But there's no explanation anywhere in the edition of how the visual elements should be interpreted. We're asked to rely on our own knowledge of what printers' ornaments mean or don't mean. The Faber website describes this edition as for students, and I'm sure it will be found on many undergraduate and postgraduate reading lists. A student might be able to work out that the headpiece, which depicts an obelisk flanked by two cherubs, is setting an appropriately neoclassical tone for Eliot's imitation of Dryden. They could not, however, be expected to know that this block was originally found in higher-end literary publications, that it did actually belong to Dryden's printer. It would help a student to understand what tone Eliot is setting here, if they knew that a 17th century ornament could instead have depicted scenes from daily life, abstract or natural imagery, snails. The use of this particular ornament is a signal of literary aspirations and has been chosen for that visual effect. Eliot's poem uses archaic language and a hyperbolic tone for its tongue-in-cheek celebration of Geoffrey Faber, and the choice of printer's ornament colludes in that. It's meant to look amusingly venerable. The tailpiece makes similar generic gestures to the headpiece, particularly with its eagle, which has a grandiose effect. It also does some things that the headpiece doesn't. First, it has a more specific relationship to the text. The image of the starry sky with the sun and moon gestures to the lines in the poem in which Faber is celebrated as a polymath and jokingly described as an astronomer and farmer. More often than sometimes claimed, I think, early modern compositors found links between their stock of ornament and the text that they were composing. That typographical ingenuity is mimicked by the 20th century printer here, contributing to the sheet's playful affectation of 1690s wit. Of course, the line of division signs that the tailpiece was replaced by conveys none of this. It articulates only the sense that something was lost when we removed the ornaments from the edition, and that the literary edition has yet to find a way of accounting for that loss. The Faber-Elliott is the only example I know of a recent English edition attempting to include ornaments. I'm an editor on the multi-volume Oxford University Press edition of the 18th century British poet Alexander Pope, and this edition will include reproductions of printers' ornaments and discussions of cases of particular interest or importance. We're still working out the details of how to do that, but it's a commitment of the volume. When we pay attention to printers' ornaments, they reveal new things. For example, by scrutinising the ornaments in our copy texts, I've discovered a pair of ornaments that were created to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht in 1713-14, depicting Queen Anne and one of her statesmen, possibly the Duke of Marlborough. We were only able to work out who these ornaments depicted by using Compositor's visual search function to work out where else they appeared and when, and we found that they appeared suddenly on the scene at exactly the time of the piece, and this led us to think about who they might depict. They were found at the head of lots of dedications to Marlborough, suggesting that might be who the male figure is. Before Compositor, if anyone ever paid attention to these ornaments, they would have just assumed they were generic decorations. By depicting Queen Anne and her statesmen, these ornaments alter the political dimensions of the poem they appear in. And once we've appreciated the messages they conveyed to the original readers of the poem, it's impossible, I think, to set them aside as a tool for interpreting the poem. And the modern literary edition must adapt to cope with this fact. Language barriers are at the front of my mind today, and as a non-French speaker here, I find it at least fitting that ornaments transcend language barriers. I have in mind a project that would use our multiple databases of printers' ornaments to survey how designs of ornaments travelled across Europe and how their designers influenced each other across borders as books circulated around the continent and beyond. It's a good moment to think about such a project because there now exist several databases of ornaments originating in different European countries and focusing on different locations and publishers. Events like this today bring some of us together, and in the future we could use our databases to say something meaningful, I think, about the development of the art of combining text and image across the European network of book production. So I look forward to ongoing collaborations, and thank you for inviting me to speak about ornaments today.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one, when I saw the candle, I was thinking in professor of history of art at the Louvre School, who said that when there is a candle that is on, it means that it's impurity. So yeah. So and most of the time, purity is represented by the candle that is off. And I was thinking whether this kind of interpretation or of symbolism in painting, are you connecting with this kind of symbolism? Is it the same, or is there a specific symbolism for?
I'd love to know the answer to that, because I've often thought about this, that there must be so many symbols that people in earlier periods were used to interpreting and just interpreted as second nature, which we've now lost or have to go to dictionaries of literary symbols to try and decode. And I think they're certainly there in printers' ornaments, but that we must miss them a lot of the time. As for whether printers' ornaments have their own symbols and things, I don't know. That's kind of the next step, I think. One of the things that we're working on, kind of set aside for now, but is tagging the types of images in Compositor, so keywords of the things depicted. And we've done that with the larger clusters in the database, but we need to find a more efficient method of tagging the rest, because that would allow us to actually see all candles in the database and look at how they look, and then compare them to images in painting or other arts.
I don't know if in painting they have database where they have database of image, but of symbolism. And related to that, the fashion of the patterns. I have two questions. Of course, the fashion for, let's say, the style, but also I observed that there are many strokes, many elements in the pattern. So they are whether rich, whether dark. is it because it was just the fashion at the time, or also it is more complicated to reproduce, to make fakes when they are short strokes? Do you have an idea of that?
My sense of it is that that's the manner of the art form, but it's a good point that it does make them less easy to copy.
Because except the elephant, where the frame is rather simple, and we could think that it is rather, I don't know, the 20th century.
Yeah.
Other one much richer and maybe more difficult to paint.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose they're starting with a block of wood or metal and then scraping away. So you start with black basically, and you remove in order to create white. So I guess you're kind of always starting with a black background, which sort of dictates the way they appear. But yeah, certainly they're more elaborate than they need to be, which could be a way of guaranteeing authenticity or of kind of making them look as their best.
You intend to merge the results of a search. If you have 1,000 occurrences of the same image, there is variance of ink. It would be great to have the possibility to see just one.
Yeah, it would. Again, this is a problem with working with the Oxford group, whose tool is fantastic but is not easily modified by us. But yeah, that kind of thing would be great. I'd love to have a much more user-friendly way of seeing these matches and clusters. So yeah, being able to see a representative image for a cluster.
So you plan to do something in this direction?
I hope so, yes. Yeah, I want to continue modifying it. It depends very much on collaboration with other teams.
Yes.
Maybe we could speak from discuss this later, because Thomas is planning to shape the code another way.
Okay.